Good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with renowned South African writer Imran Cavadia. A number of people have been instrumental in contributing to today's event. In particular, I'd like to mention my home and my co-hosts, the Department of English, Professor Lionel Posthumus, Acting Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Ruqaiya Bawa, Executive Director of the Library, Rhino Posthumus from Penguin Random House, Adele from MC Publishers, and Reneka Pandey, Director for Special Projects here in the Library, who more than anyone is responsible for this delightful occasion. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our invited speakers. Professor Ronit Frenkel is Associate Professor of English here at UJ. She is a specialist in South African and Indian Ocean writing, a long-serving administrator of and panelist for the UJ Prize for South African Writing in English. She's also an NRF-rated scholar and the author of a number of articles, happily, on the work of Imran Cavadia, including essays such as Writing South African, the Diaspora, Imran Cavadia's The Wedding, and Cavadia's Institute for Taxi Poetry and the Idea of Newness in the South African Cultural Imaginary. Our guest of honor, of course, is Imran Cavadia, Director of the Creative Writing Program at UCT and award-winning writer. He's nothing short of prolific. He's responsible for numerous journal articles for the local and international press, book reviews, scholarly monographs, non-fiction, essays, and of course, novels. His debut novel, published in 2001, the uproarious and not uncontroversial The Wedding, was described by his erstwhile lecturer J.M. Coetzee, no less, as an instance of dazzling comic wizardry. In 2006, Cavadia published what Margaret van Klemperer has described as a glorious firework of a book, another comic novel, Green-Eyed Thieves. His next novel, High, Low, In Between, was declared winner of the 2010 UJ Prize and was described by our own Craig Mackenzie as abstract, dreamlike, and pungently real. 3 years later, we were treated to his experimental and daring Institute for Taxi Poetry, that was 2012, and now, possibly, in fact certainly, his most demanding and complex novel, I think, Tales of the Metric System, published last year. This latest novel is adjudged by Ken Barris, himself a winner of the UJ Prize, to be a magnificently finessed work that defines the tension in what South African writers do between the compelling world of history and the even more necessary world of individual life, between the great actors who make our history and the small men and women who make our country. It's a great honor to welcome you, Imran, once again to UJ. Professor Frenkel, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So, Tales of the Metric System is quite different to your previous work. To me, it seems to be the most overtly political of your books so far. And I see it as a kind of a cultural history from 1970 to 2010, told through the ordinary lives of people and the impact of larger forces on their lives. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the book and your intentions behind writing it.
Well, I suppose I was interested in number 10. Krzysztof Kieślowski at the end of in 1988 and 89, when communism was ending in Poland, made a series of 10-hour-long TV programs called the Decalogue. Decalogue, I think, is just the Polish equivalent of 10 Commandments. And each story, each TV show in that Decalogue was meant to illustrate a commandment, but in a really weird way. Like, you know, the connection between the commandment and the story was quite mysterious. And they're quite beautiful stories, and quite eerie ones. And there are a couple of other cases where people have used the idea of 10ness to structure something that doesn't quite fit into a single story. So I like the number a lot. It turned out that the metric system itself was introduced. I was born in 1970, so not even sure I like the year because of that, but I'm interested in that year and in how much things changed over the time I was alive. And it turned out when I was reading about it, 1970 was when the metric system got introduced in South Africa, when they tried to implement it. In fact, they tried to implement it across the world. So I suppose I was interested in trying to think about how we measure things, measure stories, structure them, put them together. And particularly, of course, I was trying to figure out how did South Africa work, how does it change, how did each person at any one point is really stuck in their individual situation or predicament. Right? And you can only see that in retrospect. So I was trying to figure out what did these situations or predicaments mean to each of these people? How did they present themselves?
Thank you. So on some level, it seems that you're using the idea of the metric system as a metaphor for change in the book.
Yeah, or maybe a change is a metaphor for the metric system. I'm not sure. When you use strange methods to structure what you do, you're not sure which really comes first, whether it's the method that comes first or the content that comes first.
Okay, so we've got the metric system and ideas of change. And I'm going to link it to the idea that you bring up in the book that you never know where life will turn out.
Right.
And it seems to be the tension between those two structures this novel.
Right.
So what you can measure and what you can't until it's done in a sense.
Yeah.
Would you agree? Would you say that it's structured differently?
No, I mean, I agree entirely. The germ of it, I don't know if it's good to know where things come from, but sometimes it's interesting to know where they come from. The germ of it was when I was reading a bit about Rick Turner, the philosopher in Durban who was assassinated. And for some reason, thanks to Google, you can look things up that you wouldn't be able to look up otherwise. And I became interested in the fact that he had these two wives, right? He had a wife who then, and I looked up what had happened to these two wives of Rick Turner. In sequence, he didn't have them at the same time. And they had the most interesting fates. They both live in London, right? One of them went to London after he was assassinated, and she married a very famous thriller writer called Ken Follett. And she's Barbara Follett. I don't know if some of you know about her. And then she became, I think, a Labour member of Parliament. She became one of Blair's advisors. And then she had to resign in some strange scandal. The other one of his wives, who he married after Barbara, had become a hypnotherapist in London. Like, she specialized in regressing you to previous lives. So you'd go in and she would tell you what you were doing in the 16th century or whatever it was. I thought it was so interesting that his two wives would end up there, in that place. And then I also, I read a lot. I read what there was to read of Rick Turner and Steve Biko. And the other thing is, when you get to be 40, 45, whatever, you realize that most of history was committed by people in their 30s who seem really young. People who are 25, 30, they seem nowadays that seems much too young to be doing anything significant. And so it's an amazing thing to think back and imagine someone who's just 30 or 31, like Rick Turner or Steve Biko, and try to think about what did it feel like to them to be at the center of this really puzzling, frightening situation.
So the book then is kind of, it moves between ordinary characters and fairly famous recreations of these characters and the tensions between them in the book. I think some of them, most of us can pull out the Rick Turner connection, the Parks-Sparks connection. Are there any others you want to elaborate on in terms of the characterization in the book?
Well, legally, not really. My mother came to my book launch in Durban, and she asked a question. She said, "What can I do if my son keeps writing about real people? How can I stop him?" And various people kind of see bits of themselves in characters, and that's true. But almost in every case, every character is a composite of different features, or like sometimes you'll take somebody's wife and stick them with somebody else's husband, or take one characteristic of somebody and add it to another person. And you're more interested in kind of the logic of the situation rather than describing anyone particularly. I mean, with the exception of one or two politicians who I think have very interesting characters which shape the country. But also, some writers have great imaginations. Like, they can imagine amazing, interesting people. I can't really, so I have to borrow what I can from the people I know. And I mean, that's the other thing. If a writer is born into your family, it's a worrying thing for most people. It should be.
The novel also has a really interesting structure. So you start in 1970, you go through to 2010. From 1970, I think the next chapter is 1973, and it goes from there, and it then ends in 1976. 1976 is obviously an iconic year in our history, but I'm curious as to the other years. Why would you choose 1973 over 1974, for instance, in terms of the structure of this novel?
Well, look, if you're writing a book about history, it's like musicians, it's kind of like, it's only when you start as a musician that you always do everything on the beat, right? Or whatever, tap, 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 and then when you want to make something feel different or more interesting, you just do things slightly off the obvious set of beats. I think it's the same thing with history. If you want to write an interesting history of South Africa or imagine it, you can't just do it as 1976, 1990, 1994, because actually a lot of the history was in these weird interim times when it was very unclear. And I think that's really interesting about South Africa, is we have a lot of these interim years when it's very, very uncertain what's going to happen. I mean, if you think about the years 1990 through 1994, more people died in political violence then than it died in, I think, 30 years beforehand inside the country, like 20, 30, 40,000, or at least as many. And yet those years have disappeared from our historical record. I mean, occasionally people get annoyed with F.W. de Klerk about what happened in those years, but they've kind of disappeared from our imagination. We kind of just went straight from 1990 through 1994. But actually, I mean, as you can tell from the period we're living through now, in a way that uncertainty and lack of direction is much more characteristic of our country than, say, 1994 or 1976.
I was very curious about the quote that starts off this book, which I'm going to read very briefly. So you start the book with a quote from Paul Kruger's memoirs, which says, "I set forth how I viewed the history of my people in the light of God's word. I began by addressing my hearers, people of the Lord, you old people of the country, you foreigners, you newcomers, yes, even you thieves and murderers." Can you tell us a bit more about this quote and why it stands at the beginning of this book?
It was the only interesting line I could find in his memoirs. But it's a great line, and it imagines South Africa as a whole constellation of different, basically pretty terrible people. Like, we were all terrible, thieves and murderers and people of God, and there's kind of anguish there. But also, the idea of viewing things in God's light is an outrageous idea, but it's quite an appealing one. The idea of trying to be entirely impersonal about seeing how these things fit together. And obviously no one can do that. But I thought it was an interesting idea that he was trying to address all these people and set out for them the story that had brought them to where they were. I don't know, I mean, I don't know if it was outrageous of me to quote that at the beginning or not. But I thought it was puzzling enough that nobody would really mind or decipher it.
I'm looping back to where I started the questions a little bit with the metric system.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of the book that the world changed with the units of measurement when the metric system comes in. And in that same chapter in the beginning, the character Neil you describe as being the only person who was prepared for the metric system and could understand it because he'd been practicing it in his head before it comes in.
Right.
The novel then ends with Neil's assassination. I was curious as to what trajectory you're positing with that.
With the idea of his learning the metric system first.
And being the only person to really understand it.
Well, look, there's a thought that's behind that, but it's like one of those eccentric thoughts. I don't know if it's of any interest, but intuitively there's a connection between measuring things in rational units of 10 and measuring people equally, like assuming that people are equal. And democracy, and certainly French democracy and units of 10 and the metric system went together in the whole 19th century. Right? So during the French Revolution, they introduced the metric system and changed conventional units to much more standard units. Right? But in general, in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, people started thinking, can't we count in a different way to pounds and yards and gallons and quarts? And if you look at countries like France, there were often 20 or 30 different systems of measurement in the country. So you couldn't trade because someone would offer you one full hogshead of whatever it was in exchange for. So intuitively, there's a connection between liberal thinking and standardized measurements. Right? But in fact, if you think about the United States, it's the reason that the dollar is divided into 100 cents, it was the first currency that was ever divided into 100 cents. Because Jefferson, who is this classic liberal, came back from France and said, why don't we have a rational dollar, right? Instead of a dollar composed of 240 cents. So progressive people did think that you had to measure things clearly. However, in the 20th century, the only countries which succeeded in metricalizing, turning the systems into units of 10, were basically police states or after a revolution. Right? So South Africa managed, and the Soviets kind of managed, but in Britain and the United States, they tried. There were cartoons like, there was a superhero called some kind of metric man, and there was a metric council to convert people to the metric system. But when Reagan and Thatcher took power, they actually abolished those metric committees. And so they said, we're going to just stick with the measurements we have. Which is one of the reasons that the Challenger disaster happened, because the units that the engineers were using for the space shuttle were actually imperial units, and the computer was working in the metric system. But anyway, it at least tells you that that intuitive connection between measuring people equally and measuring things rationally doesn't quite work for the way modern states work. And I thought that was a really interesting fact about measurement and the oddness of which we switched over to a metric system very quickly. I mean, clearly it was because we were a police state. I don't know, I'm not entirely sure why that's funny, but I guess it's kind of funny. And I think I was also interested in what police states were like. I mean, one of the things, when you think about each person's situation, when you think about what someone's situation was in 1970, or even when I was growing up, you realize we were just so policed, like where you could walk in a city and your sense of being under observation was amazing. I mean, we really were a very surveilled society, and I think all those things kind of interested me in different ways. So I'm not sure I have a clear argument as to why I called the book this. I like the idea of tales as well, because I'm not really sure I can tell a story properly. So I thought if I called it tales, everybody would kind of overlook that, or would force me to write stories.
Just a final question. If we place this book in the trajectory of what you've written before, each of your novels is fairly different in terms of subject matter, in terms of style, in terms of the different nuances and ambiguities you seem to draw out. What can we expect from you next?
Nothing. No, I mean, this is the last thing I can think of, so that's why I wrote it. I tried to write before about, look, it's also an attempt to find an envelope for all the different situations defined racially in terms of class and gender. It's almost impossible to find a South African book which manages to give you a sense of how broad the country is, of what you can see if you take a 5-minute drive from wherever you are. So it was trying to see, can can you put those together imaginatively? And I couldn't 10 years ago because I tried and it was a terrible mess. So you have to learn a bunch of things to write the book you really want to write. One of the things you learn is how much you can leave out and still seem to know what you're talking about. You know, I think that's one skill that writers really have to have, right? So you can kind of write about a kid who's 17 in a workers' hostel, or you can pretend to, or about I don't know, spy in London, or a Russian diplomat. If you just realize that it's all a surface, so there isn't anything underneath the surface that readers ever get to see. So as long as you get the surface right, it should be okay. And I think that was the lesson I had to learn and figure out to be able to write it. But now I've figured it out, and I don't really know what else I have to contribute. I mean, really. So I've decided to just write film scripts in the future. Or something, I'm not sure. I wrote a piece about dogs after finishing this. Because I got, you know, when Jacob Zuma got into all that trouble about dogs, saying that, and then I just remembered, if you ever jog or cycle in South Africa, you get barked at by dogs all the time. And dogs are quite, I mean, I like dogs, but they're complicated animals, you know, in terms of where we are. And so I don't know, I did some research. I found out that we're the only country to have a police dog memorial. And that we actually were the leaders in creating bloodhounds in the 1920s, which would track down criminals. So that interested me, but I can't think of anything in fiction that I want to write.
Well, I hope you do continue with fiction somewhere along the line. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee. I'd like to ask one question, and that is, you were talking about, you know, sort of going back to the decade in which you were born, where you had to do some research and Google things and so on. And it seems to me that there are chapters later in the book where you must have lived through it. For example, the chapter about the World Cup, which is actually very funny in many respects. The World Cup is taking place in Cape Town, and the young woman gets her cell phone stolen, and she has to go and buy it back from the thief. I mean, it's quite satirical and quite funny. Did you find a difference between writing about a lived experience and researched experience?
Well, I mean, in principle, none of the experience is actually mine. I mean, it's all just stuff I borrowed from other people. So that...
I suppose I mean the World Cup was a lived experience, I presume.
Well...
If you didn't experience the World Cup, where were you?
That's a good point. My friend Harry Garuba at UCT says that the best books come out of things that you hear, not things that you live through yourself. And it might be that maybe to be a good writer, you have to actually not experience anything and just seem to be overhearing everything. Like maybe I did with the World Cup. But the cell phone thing I knew because I had a student who got his phone stolen on campus, and then somehow he got a call. The person who had stolen it called various numbers on his phone. So they called his friends and then offered to sell him back the cell phone, which I thought was kind of a really ingenious idea, because why go to all the trouble of breaking it up into individual parts and then whatever they do with cell phones. So I thought that, there's a lot of ingenuity there. So I wrote about. I was also trying to write about teenagers because I have a teenage son, so I know that I have nothing in common with teenagers. I thought I might try and figure out.
That's really writing about what you don't know.
Yeah. I don't know how they became so much worse than they used to be when I was a teenager. But also, I think that's the thing about South Africa. Sometimes, individually, your moods depend, or your sense about the country depends a lot on where you come from and what's happening to you. So if you're like 50, 40, 30, you have a very different mood, or if your parents were poor, your parents were rich, your relationship to what it's like in 2015 is really different to someone who, say, might have a different set of starting points. So I think, if you're at 45, it's quite easy to be gloomy about South Africa, but if you're 17, in a sense, you don't have that choice. You really have to make your life here in some way, or most people who are 17 do. So I thought it was interesting to think about that situation, where you have, in a sense, you have to have enforced optimism.
I think, I can't remember who it was someone terribly famous, so let's just say it was Napoleon, I can't remember. And this person said, if you want to know about a person, ask where they were when they were 20.
Yeah.
And I think you captured that in that particular chapter.
Well, I like to think I captured what 44-year-olds think of 20-year-olds. Because I don't think 20-year-olds actually read very much, but it's, the audience is much more 40-year-olds. So as long as they think it's authentic.
I think 44-year-olds care what 20-year-olds think more than 20-year-olds care what 44-year-olds
That's probably
think.
true.
Yeah. Great. I'd like to open up the questions and the conversation to the floor. Are there any comments or questions that you'd like to ask our guest? Tamsin.
Do you find it daunting having to write more after you've had successfully published novels, or is it something that comes naturally to you because you know that you've done it and achieved it before?
No, I take a much gloomier view. I mean, there are writers in South Africa who can be pretty clear that they're successful, right? But most of what we think of as success, what might look like success for like an hour, is actually very small culturally. I mean, if you write a book and it sells 3,000 copies in South Africa, it's actually quite a lot of copies for a serious novel. So you would spend the money that you made writing a book which might have taken you 3 years in about 3 hours easily if you have an expensive child or some kind of habit. So our success is very narrow and it's very fragile. I mean, I think it's probably true of the country as well. So I never really felt very successful. So I just kept writing to see if I couldn't write something that many more people would like. But I'm not really sure I figured it out, actually.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Yes. Related question. When did you first imagine you would be a published writer?
I don't know. I was supposed to be I was sort of brought up to be a physicist or a scientist. So my idea of being, I guess, of changing my mind was to study, it was to try out different things and work out that I actually wasn't very good at them. So I studied physics for a year or so, roughly, but it was right at the end of the Cold War, and all these, I mean, this is going to seem really odd, but I'm pretty sure it was true. All these Bulgarians arrived in universities around the world, and they had amazing Bulgarian mathematics training. So if you were in a mathematics class with a Bulgarian or two Bulgarians, you realize there's no way you could compete. I mean, they were like, Russian chess players or whatever. So I decided I couldn't really be a physicist, and then I wasn't a very good philosophy student because I couldn't figure out why the answers that they thought were good answers were good answers. So then I studied literature, and I became interested in writing, but I think it's because you can kind of pose the questions and the answers at the same time. Right? So nobody can actually tell you you're wrong, and you can still you might still be a very good writer or not. Nobody can be sure of it. And that's good. That's an appealing quality. The worst fate you can really suffer is just obscurity and neglect, which are also okay, actually. That's fates.
The guidance you give to your creative writing students at UCT?
I asked them what their backup plan is. I had one of my favorite students actually is an actor, and he said, no, being a writer is my backup plan. I thought, no, that's not the right idea at all. I think also you need, I think even most friends of mine who are academics, you need parts of your life which are different to what you do primarily. So even having a strictly academic career is often not as enriching as people want it to be. You need some art form or creativity. I think even as a writer, you also sometimes need structure, or the sense that you're, providing for your family or making the world a better place or whatever it is making. So it's probably better to have more than one thing that you do.
Thank you so much. I presume you were serious when you said you are interested in writing film scripts and working on that assumption. What kind of film scripts did you have in mind, and have you actually written any?
Well, I'm trying, but there were two. One is based on one of my favorite movies is a movie called Rules of the Game. Like older people probably have seen it, young people wouldn't. It's just it's a movie that Renoir, who was the son of Renoir the painter, made in 1938. And it's an amazing movie about a kind of French country house and all these different things that happen at that country house over the weekend. So I thought it would be interesting to try and writing something like that around a wine farm. But that seems a bit daunting. So the other thing I've been trying out more recently is trying to write a superhero movie, the first African superhero movie, because I feel like why should we look up to Western or Russian superheroes? Why don't we have our own superheroes? But also because everybody wants to make a superhero.
Or like Neil Fun, nice sci-fi. Yes.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what about your wonderful sense of humour and wit? Where's that going to fit in?
I think if you want to be paid for that, you have to be a comedian.
Well, that's your backup plan.
No, comedians tend to be young. I think they tend to be in their 20s and 30s. I think a sense of humor is more of a liability. It gets you into much more trouble than you need to be. Certainly if you work in organizations, you probably don't want to have a sense of humor.
Thank you.
I was interested as well about the film script thing, because when I was reading this book, I really was thinking a lot of Robert Altman films, with all these different strands, and they all kind of tie up at the end. So perhaps there's a script here as well.
Yeah, no, there might be. I mean, it's more, I think, if you keep doing something for long enough, you realize that there's some core to it, which you finally figure out. I mean, writing's quite a mysterious thing. And so I think the core I realized was that everybody is in a particular situation. Everyone has their story unwinding. And that's true of movies, and that happens in scene by scene by scene. And that's true of movies and novels. It's kind of underlying logic of both of them. But to see that requires, it took me, I mean, maybe it's slow, it took me about 20 years to understand that about novels. Before that, I thought that novels were made out of language or sentences or something else, but now I think they're actually made out of situations. I think movies are.
And you've got so many situations in this book, so I'm wondering, just from a practical level, did you have a big wall with plot lines panned out and post-its and red lines and blue lines connecting people? Did you have a picture of this novel? Or was it just all somehow in your head?
No, I actually forget stuff almost immediately. I like things into my mind and I forget them. So I'm a very sequential person. I can only deal with like a small thing once, and then I forget about it. So I just tried to put it together so I could just deal with, this particular thing and then this thing, and then think in some sort of abstract way about what architecture needed to fit together.
And then did you rely on the editor to make sure that it all fell together? Because a lot of writers do that.
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, I have an editor, and he's very nice, but I think by the time they get that, I've thought about it a fair amount. And you'd be surprised how many mistakes get through things. I'm not sure that there are any mistakes in this book yet, but maybe we'll find some.
It's kind of academics, you do realize.
Mistakes, yeah. Someone told me that there's a Jaguar in the first page of this book, and someone told me it should have been a Bentley. Jaguar. I don't know what I forgot.
Never give the critics something to look for. Okay.
So what keeps you motivated to keep on writing?
I remember seeing an interview with a biologist who won the Nobel Prize. He said that the most mysterious thing is he couldn't understand is why he got up every day and did stuff. That's quite mysterious. I don't know. I'm not particularly motivated right now. And I don't know why people are motivated. I mean, presumably it's linked to something quite deep inside you as to why you keep doing something. But I think the other side of the question is also very interesting, is when do you stop doing things, or when do you give up, or when do you try out a novel for 50 pages or 100 pages and just stop doing it? I think those are also really interesting questions to think about. But I don't think it's not that I'm especially driven, I just had a lot of time to do it. And I figured out if you just spend a few hours every day doing something, even on the weekends, you could avoid your family. And actually you get to really like those hours. I think it's just liking being alone for a certain number of hours a day. It's quite, and also liking doing stuff by yourself. I don't know if that's motivation enough.
I agree with your previous statement that writing is a mysterious thing. So I'm interested to know how then do you pin it down? How then do you quantify it as something to be taught as part of the creative writing program? How do you measure someone's ability or success as part of that program, which I assume at some point you give them a thumbs up and say, go out and prosper in the real world?
Yeah. You do have to kind of shove them up after a while. Look, there's a 100% negative correlation between how successful I think a writer's going to be and how successful they are, measured by how much money they make. Like, you know, the program I run, against the wishes of everyone at my university, it has generated a lot of very well-paid writers over the last 10 years. And at least for a few of them, I still keep thinking, if only we could have taught them to write while they were here, you know, they would be making much less money. But you know, I could have ruined their lives. But you know, really, the thing about art forms is you really can't tell what people want. I mean, to this, I think the ultimate mysterious question is, what on earth keeps someone reading a book or watching a movie, and what makes them watch this movie or read this book or the other one? I really don't have an answer, but I think it's a really deep question about how our feelings interact with pages. So I'm not sure writing anything can really be taught. I think you can have spaces where sometimes interesting things happen, ideally. Sometimes terrible things happen, but sometimes more interesting things happen. I think you have to accept you really can't predict how art forms work. But that sometimes good people do good things, unexpectedly.
So I suppose what I really wanted to know is how do you structure this program? Like, do you have like a writing course? How does it really work?
Mostly people just bring in work that they're, things that they're working on, and everybody talks about it. But the ultimate thing is just that you have people to share what you're doing with as you're trying it out. Now, I think most grown-up writers, or most people who've been writing for a long time, very rarely show stuff to other people. Or they might show things to one or two other people. But I think at first it's quite an interesting experiment as you're trying things out to see how people react. Now, one of the first things you learn is people are just not consistent. Right? So if there are 10 people around the table, you almost certainly get 9 or 10 different pieces of totally contradictory advice. But even learning to manage that is kind of a central thing, I think, in writing, and useful.
Oh, I'm going to go with her first.
Oh, no, I wanted to know, like, before you write your book, do you already have an idea of how it's going to end, or do you think about it as you go?
No, I think I usually figure out an ending. I think I have some idea of an ending, but it always turns out to be wrong. Which is probably true of life as well. You have some idea of how you're going to die, but actually it's quite surprising for most people how they actually end up dying. So I think stories, but I think an ending has to feel in some way connected or generated by what happens in the book. You know, like I think a really good ending, and I think those endings, like the titles of books, they only come to you somewhat quite late in the process. And like I often go through many different titles, try out different endings, and then you realize that what's the ending chronologically? So this book ends chronologically in 2010, but the actual ending on the page is in 1976. So you also shuffle that stuff around. And you know, there's no real rule as to why you change things. You're just trying to get the right feeling to it. You know, it's quite hard to define what that is. But there's like a clink. I mean, in music, it's called a cadence. Or, you know, everybody's ear knows what the closing chord is in a piece of music. You know, it sounds like it's ending, and I think you try and find what that sound is, or that equivalent is.
I was curious who some of your favorite authors might be, what was you inspired by?
Favorite authors? Yeah. If you spend too much time around books, like anything, you just get disillusioned with them because you spend your time thinking about them and reading them over and over again until they stop working. You know? I think that's always like the trick. You just, if there's something that really strikes me, I just keep reading until it stops having any effect on me. So you kind of wear out your favorite authors over time. But I think that leaves a couple authors who I keep reading, old books. Tolstoy, I find Tolstoy unbearable a lot of the time, but amazing at other times. You know, often in the same book, there'll be one chapter that's incredible, and then 5 that are terrible, but then the one that's amazing is really amazing. other books come back at random points. Great Expectations is still, I think, a really good, strange book. Or Hamlet. I mean, really boring books, I think, by people's standards. And then you also look at what people are writing right now to see if they haven't figured out something that you have no idea about. You know? And often there's useful stuff there. When I was writing this, I was reading a book called Sepharad, which is a Spanish book which just gets all these stories from different people who died in the Second World War, but it puts them together really well. And you borrow things from movies, almost anything. You know, I think you have to be pretty open that way.
Yeah, I just need to know, what exactly are your intentions when you write? Are you trying to teach us or send us a message? For example,
towards the end of your book, I haven't read it yet, like she mentioned something about the 2010 World Cup. This incident about the lady who falls down and she buys a bag. Are you trying to entertain us and it's a novel, or are you trying to entertain us while teaching us something and sending out a message?
Because at least not as a writer, because I don't think, I think if you can say something directly to somebody, then why not say it directly? Like, why bother to teach anybody in an indirect way? It seems to me that you might as well just be straightforward about something to teach. So I don't think it's teaching. I think like there's an ancient quote, whether it's Pythagoras or Erasmus, I don't know, that it came in handy for me once because it was in a Latin exam, and I knew it in English, and so I managed to pass the Latin exam. But the quote is something like, life is like a marketplace. Some people come to buy, some people come to sell, and some people just come to see what's going on. And I think if you're a writer or a reader, you're definitely in that third category of people. Like there are lots of people who buy and sell really effectively, whether they're professionals or businessmen or taxi drivers, but I think there's an aspect of just being interested in what's going on and trying to reproduce it in some way that's essential to this. And also, I think there's, I think I like making stuff. And I think writing is kind of, writing a book is you're making something. And I think it makes life seem less useless because otherwise a day goes by and there was a day, what happened? Whereas if you've made some part of something, it feels somewhat better. It seems logical. You seem more puzzled now. Ask another question.
So I think we need to give our best to wrap, but if there's one last question perhaps? At the back there?
What consists of a good writer? I mean, I think we all have a story to tell, but I think some of our novels will probably be boring or something. But what, do you have to be like a good liar or something? Do you have to invent that kind of liar? Because you seem like a pretty smart guy, you could just tell by meeting you here. You should have considered a career in law, I'm sure you would.
I do actually, I keep considering a career in law. I don't think, but firstly, I don't know I don't think anyone knows if they're a good writer or not. I mean, I think you know if you make a lot of money writing, or if lots of people are interested in what you write. I think there are probably 3 or 4 people in this country who can say that, but I don't think I'm one of them. So I think it's quite hard to say if you're a good writer. I don't think good writers tend to be good liars, because good liars are probably quite effective people. They can look you in the eye and say stuff, whatever. But that also means you can't be a very perceptive person, right? And to write, you do need to perceive stuff about yourself, but more importantly, about other people. You need to register what's going on with them, try to figure it out. You need to listen to how people sound or how to stuff that's happening. I don't think that's connected with lying very well. I'm not sure there are good writers. I think there, for various accidental reasons, I think people sometimes write good books. But I don't think there's anybody who ever was a good writer for 30 years in a row and just wrote everything perfectly. I think even the most amazing writers, like Shakespeare or Dickens, just wrote, Dickens certainly wrote a huge amount of junk. And There's Shakespeare plays you really would not want to read. I mean, there's one crazy, I forget the one with the pirate, but it's, you know, it's a terrible pirate play, or the one with Aaron the Moor. Anyway, that's also terrible. So even people we think of as amazing writers produce a lot of junk in the course of their careers. So the question is, what lets them do interesting stuff a couple times, 5 or 6 times in your life? I don't know. Some of it is intense concentration on something, being able to follow a project or a thought. I think being interested in life without being taken in by it is probably a good thing. But it's probably good. That's probably good for almost any profession. Yeah. And I still regret not having been a lawyer. Such a sensible career. It seems like, you know, you realize that actually when you're 20, it seems like it's equally legitimate to be a lawyer or a writer or whatever, right? And then when you're older, you realize the sensible people, the people who actually run the world, you know, and do interesting things, tend to be more of the lawyerly type than of the, you know, writers or poets or composers type. And it's not a bad thing to run things or to make the world better or to help people, you know, stop being hungry or richer. So, you know, it's a warning.
Okay, well, I think we'll end there. I'd like to thank you, Imran, for being such a responsive and thoughtful and generous guest. And I think everybody feels that you've really responded to their questions with a great deal of thought. And I think you are a good writer. Okay, I think we can say that. Okay. So thank you very much. A round of applause, please, for
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.